All right, everyone, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and we're just about to get started here. First of all, I wanted to say thank you and welcome everyone for joining us today. My name is Allie Toomey. I am the Education Coordinator for Earth Echo International, and we are presenting this day of the National Biodiversity Teach-In alongside Elgin High School and Miss Perryman's class. I'm really excited about this next presentation. This next presentation is coming from an organization that we've worked with a lot in the past, the Khaled bin Sultan Living Oceans Foundation. And they are a nonprofit organization located near Annapolis, Maryland, that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and restoring the world's ocean through science, education, and communication. Their scientific research is primarily focused on researching and mapping coral reefs. This includes studying the number, size, and types of sharks present on the coral reef. And they recently completed a 5-year mission called Global Reef Expedition, which studied corals all around the world. And from Living Oceans today, we have Alex Dempsey. Alex studies coral reefs in some of the most remote areas of the world. She has been on over 1,500 dives, studying corals in places like the Great Barrier Reef, Fiji, the Galapagos Islands, and Jamaica. Her main job is to support coral reef research on the Global Reef Expedition, which is a 6-year mission to study the health, diversity, and resilience of coral reefs around the world. She is also conducting research into the Crown of Thorns Starfish, a voracious coral predator that is a plague upon the reefs in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. Alex collects tissue samples from the Crown of Thorns Starfish wherever she encounters them across their range in hopes of learning more about the genetics of these elusive animals. And that is what Alex is going to be talking about today. So I'm really excited to learn more about this voracious starfish that is a predator, which is not something you normally think of when you think of starfish. So go ahead, Alex, take it away.
Okay, great. It looks like my video might have just cut out. See if I can try to get that back on. Living Oceans Foundation. And today we're going to talk about corals and coral reefs and a starfish that Ali had mentioned called the Crown of Thorns. But first, before we get into talking about this starfish, we need to give a little bit of an overview of what a coral is and what the roles are in a coral reef ecosystem. So I'm going to just play a short little video that'll kind of give a refresher or a brief overview of what a coral is.
A coral reef. It can be one of the liveliest places on Earth. But what's really surprising is how much more goes on here than meets the eye. Even the corals themselves are alive. They're made up of tiny animals called coral polyps, distant cousins of jellyfish. Hundreds, even thousands of polyps can make up a coral. And this impressive reef, they built it, millimeter by millimeter. How? A polyp is mostly stomach, with a mouth on top. It sits in a hard skeleton that's part of the reef. The polyp takes in dissolved minerals from the water and mixes them with proteins. Then it rises up out of its skeleton, leaving space below. It deposits calcium carbonate, also known as limestone, into this space. Over time, each little polyp not only builds its own skeleton, but adds to the structure of the reef. So what gives the polyp the energy for all this building? A unique partnership. Inside most reef-building polyps are tiny algae called zooxanthellae. They use energy from the sun to photosynthesize, producing up to 95% of the food the corals need. As animals, the corals emit nutrients valuable to the algae too, and also give them a protected place in which to live. This trade-off benefits both the algae and the corals. It's called a symbiotic relationship. The algae are even responsible for the colors we identify with corals.
Okay, great. So that was just a little overview of what a coral is and how they come together as an ecosystem. And just, I know that was kind of like a lot of information that was thrown at you. So let's just do a really quick overview of what a coral is. So it's composed of these three main parts. So the plant part of a coral is that zooxanthellae, which is a single cell algae. And then also the animal part of the coral is the coral polyp. And then the mineral is actually the calcium carbonate that the coral polyps are able to make.
Hey, Alex, it's a little quiet. I'm not sure if it's you or the system, but if you could just try to speak up a little bit, that might compensate for the... Yeah, that's a lot better.
Is that better? Okay, great. Okay, so here are some microscope slides of the coral polyps, and then these small little dots here where I'm pointing at the cursor on, those are actually the zooxanthellae, which gives the corals their pigment. And then these little animals that are up here near the tentacles are actually zooplankton. And another important thing to point out is what's known as a mutualistic symbiotic relationship between the algae, the zooxanthellae, and coral, the animal. So here on the left is a microscope slide of what zooxanthellae look close up. And you can see here they have colored pigmentations. And because they're algae, they use photosynthesis. And a byproduct of photosynthesis is, of course, oxygen. And that oxygen and the food nutrients from the photosynthesis goes back into the coral. And then the coral is able to use that oxygen for respiration. And then, of course, a byproduct of respiration is CO2, which then goes back to help the algae photosynthesize. And also, when the polyps are able to create the calcium carbonate mineral, it also acts as a home or a shelter for the zooxanthellae. So that's kind of how both the algae and the corals are able to live together in a symbiotic relationship. Right, so there are many different species of coral. And one way that scientists are able to classify them are by their shapes, what we call growth forms. And what a growth form is basically the different way that the coral grows, the shape of it. And so here I've laid out some of the main types of growth forms that marine biologists or coral ecologists look at. So the first one here is branching corals. They kind of look like little fingers that are sticking up from the substrate. The next one here is columnar, which has a similar shape to like columns that would be found on a building or in front of your house. Encrusting corals are just that, they're encrusting, so they form a very, very thin crust on top of the substrate on the ocean floor. Foliose corals can grow in this beautiful kind of flower shape or whorl type shape, hence the name foliose, because they kind of look like, flower petals. Free living or solitary corals are one single polyp, and they're not attached to the ocean floor, so you can actually pick them up. And so yeah, so they're just, but that's just made up of one polyp, whereas these other ones are made up of several polyps to create the colony. Here are massive corals. These are very, very important corals on the reef. They're the main frame builder or building blocks that are responsible for the integrity and shape of the reef. And they kind of look like boulders or kind of big rocks. This funny word, facoloid, describes a type of coral that has a shape similar to a lollipop. So the coral polyp is here on the top, and then it's connected to kind of like a stalk. And then, of course, the last one is plating corals, and it's called plating corals because it does look like a dinner plate. And so these are some of the growth forms that we use in classifying corals. I just want to bring up two more points on this. So branching corals and massive corals are two very, very common and very important corals on the reef. Branching corals here are the fastest growing corals and can grow very fast in a very small amount of time. Whereas massive corals can take 50 to 100, 200 years to grow in size. And these two corals will come up again later in the talk when we're talking about Crown of Thorns. So it's important to remember these two growth forms. And here I have actually, I have a coral skeleton here. This is what we would describe as a branching coral. And this is a species that is actually quite common on the reef. Coral reefs are one of the most diverse and productive ecosystems in the world. They host millions of different species, and they've been termed rainforests of the sea. So I'm sure most of you know that coral reefs are under a lot of stress and are in trouble. And we have so the threats of the coral reefs can be split into three different groups. So the first group is physical damage, and physical damage encompasses storms, overfishing, and tourism. The second group is high CO2 in oceans, where the actual ocean chemistry is changing from warming ocean events and ocean acidification. And the third one is water quality. So when fertilizer nutrient runoff goes into the ocean, it causes the water to become more turbid or very murky, which makes perfect breeding ground for what we're going to talk about next, the Crown of Thorns starfish. The Crown of Thorns starfish, or as we abbreviate COTS, because it's kind of a long name, is a group of animals that are called echinoderms, which include sand dollars, sea cucumbers, brittle stars, and sea urchins. And as you can see from the spikes that are here on the animal, why they're called a Crown of Thorns starfish. Okay, so what are COTS? Okay, so as you can see here, they're pretty menacing and sinister looking. They're covered in hundreds of these very long, sharp spines. They have usually 14 to 18 legs and can grow usually on average between 25 and 35 centimeters. One thing to notice here, if you see where I'm pointing on my cursor, this fuzzy little patch here, that is actually a toxin called saponin. And saponin is actually embedded in the skin of the starfish. And so what happens is if the starfish is being preyed upon or is being poked or prodded, it will spine you, and in the process of spining you, it will release this toxin. It will release this toxin into the skin, and it then the toxin then has a steroid in it, and it causes wherever you're being spined to inflame very, very quickly.
Hey, Alex.
Another
Sorry to interrupt you,
yeah.
But we have a request. If you look at the top of next to where it says start slides, there's a little pen tool. And some of the classes are asking if you would be able to use that to circle what you want them to see. Okay. Yeah, if you can just use that pen tool, that would be awesome.
No problem. Yeah, sure. So let me just backtrack a little bit. So this is the area I was talking about right here. I'm coloring it in blue. Are these fuzzy little patch? That's where the toxin is actually embedded in the skin. And so okay, great. I'm glad you can see. So what happens then? So after the spine is then injected into your skin with this toxin, your hand can swell up or wherever you're stung. But then also there's an anticoagulant in this toxin, which means you're not able to form a blood clot, and you can bleed quite a bit. Okay, where are COTS found in the world? So here we have, and I'm gonna just lightly outline some of these red right here, some of these red dots, they're here around Australia, and then up through the South Pacific, up near Japan, and then around to, let's see, like Palau, around that region, and then over to, they're found in the Hawaiian Islands, Tonga and Fiji, French Polynesia, which is where Tahiti and Bora Bora is, and then all the way here up into the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean here, the east coast of Africa, Madagascar, and then also all the way to the Gulf of California here on the west coast of the United States. Okay, what part of the reef do COTS live? So the Crown of Thorns have a very unique anatomy and body system, which I'll talk about next. But because of their unique body structure, they're able to squeeze into little nooks and crannies on the reef. And so they're usually hidden amongst the corals where there's not a lot of wave action or current disturbance. And so during the daytime, they try to hide up underneath some of these corals and in these cracks, and then at night they come out to feed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about COTS anatomy. So here on the left are some Crown of Thorns starfish that were collected from the ocean and placed here on a beach. And what you're looking at here is actually the underside of the starfish. So the spiky spines part are actually now in the sand. So this is the underbelly of the organism. And so what you can see here, and I'll draw it in blue, are kind of these yellow little suckers. Those are the animal's tube feet, and I'll explain that in the next slide a little bit more. But so there's 2 rows of these that are on each of its legs. And then here, I just drew that circle, you see kind of that tan, mushy, kind of gross looking stuff? That's actually the stomach of the animal. And I'll explain that in a little bit as well. But the circle here, where the stomach is coming in and out of, is known as the oral disc, which is also the mouth of the organism. And what's important about that is Crown of Thorns have a water vascular system. And what that means is through the oral disc here, the starfish can siphon water through its mouth and then hydraulically propel itself up on top of the substrate, and that's how it's able to move around. It's a very, very specialized oral disc that enables this type of movement for the starfish. Okay, how do COTS move? So remember I just talked about these little tube feet here that I just circled in blue here. These are pretty much suckers. They're like suction cups, and they allow the starfish to climb over corals and are able to grasp onto the reef if there's waves or if there's currents, that type of thing. But they're able to move actually quite a long distance. They can move upwards to 20 yards in a day and 580 meters in a week, which is almost 6 football fields. So for a starfish that you would probably think doesn't get around very much, they can move quite easily and quite quickly. Okay, how do COTS eat? So like I said, they have this very special way of eating. So they're what we call corallivores. So their main diet is coral. And they are specialists at coral feeding. So what happens is the Crown of Thorns, the starfish, will climb on top of a coral and will suction itself on and will then expel its stomach through its mouth. And that stomach was kind of that mushy tan stuff. Will expel its stomach through its mouth and then kind of wrap around the coral, and they have very specific enzymes that then break down the coral tissue so the starfish can digest it. This usually takes about 4 to 6 hours, and once that is completed, the starfish will then pull its stomach back through its mouth inside itself and crawl onto the next reef. And I have a video that actually shows this. Okay, so here's a Crown of Thorns that is positioning itself on top of a coral. And that's its stomach that's able to just wrap around the coral, and its enzymes are then breaking down the coral tissue for it to digest. Okay. So, prey preference. Do crown of thorns like a particular type of coral more than others? The answer is yes. So remember how I talked about earlier about growth forms of coral. So that's going to come into play here. So I have listed here some pictures of the different types of corals that the crown of thorns like to eat. So the top three here are a type of branching coral, so that fast-growing coral, and that's their favorite type of food. And so the crown of thorns will actually anchor itself sometimes underneath these types of table corals, or crawl on top of branching corals. So this crown of thorns just ate this coral, which is why it's all white, because all of its tissue, the starfish is now eaten. This is another branching coral, more like those fingers that I talked about, and these white parts here are also part of the coral that's been eaten. So once the crown of thorns goes through and eats all its favorite coral, it'll then go through again and eat its second, third, and fourth favorite coral. So here is a crown of thorns eating encrusting and plating corals, and then they can even eat those free-living solitary corals I talked about. They just wrap themselves around the coral and then extend their stomach. And their least favorite coral is the massive coral that I talked about, the really slow-growing coral. This is important because once the crown of thorns has gone through and eaten all its favorite food, it'll go to its last resort, which is this massive coral. But once this coral is eaten, it's going to take a very long time, if ever, for that coral to grow back. And this is why crown of thorns are becoming a very big problem in the Indo-Pacific oceans. Okay, how do COTS reproduce? They reproduce through sexual reproduction. And here we have this photo here. So you see this cloud right here that I just outlined. So this cloud is actually a female that is spawning. And so these are her eggs that she's just released. And here, which is a little bit more difficult to see, but you can see kind of a white cloud. This is a male, and he's releasing sperm. So the eggs and sperm are released into the water column and then fertilized to be larvae. And the larvae then kind of float along for several months, about maybe 5 or 6 months, until they finally settle on the reef. And they can travel as far as 300 kilometers. So when they finally settle on the reef, they settle deep, deep in the reef, like 200, 250 feet, until they reach about this size. Now this is a baby crown of thorns right here. And he's about, he's probably 13 months old. So once the crown of thorns gets to that age, they're actually able now to eat coral. So they'll stop eating the algae and other things that they were feeding on when they were younger, and they'll start to crawl up from the depths of the deep into, around 30 feet, 30, 40, 50, 60 feet to where all the coral is so they can feed. Another thing to note is one female can produce 60 million eggs in one spawning event, and there are sometimes 1 to 2 to 3 spawning events in a year. So that makes the crown of thorns the most reproductively successful invertebrate in the world. Okay, do crown of thorns have predators? They do. Here are just some examples here. This is a triggerfish, which is a type of fish that is found on coral reefs. This here is Napoleon wrasse, which is a very, very big type of fish as well that's also on coral reefs. And this here actually is a trumpet triton, which is a type of snail, so like a conch or a helmet snail, and they actually eat the crown of thorns. And I have one here actually. So you can see when they're grown, they're quite big. And this specimen is actually from that we found in Fiji. And this is a trumpet triton because it kind of looks like a trumpet, and they feed quite regularly on crown of thorns. And I have a video to show you how that happens. Okay, here we go. So here's the crown of thorns on top of this coral, and there is the snail that's able to climb out of its shell on top of the crown of thorns to eat it.
And other gastropods,
so the helmet snail also does this, and this is the Napoleon wrasse I mentioned before, the triggerfish, and then pufferfish as well. Okay. Why are COTS a threat? So they are naturally occurring on the reef. So 1, 2, maybe 3 crown of thorns on a reef That's okay. That actually helps biodiversity. But what happens when an outbreak occurs, which I'll talk about what exactly an outbreak is here in a minute, they wreak havoc on the reef. They go through and indiscriminately eat any coral that they see. And this can cause what we call a phase shift in the ecosystem, which means that once the corals are now eaten, they leave open substrate or open space for algae to come in, and algae can colonize very quickly. And so once the algae comes in, the corals now have nowhere to reseed, to recruit, so there's no more space left for them to come back. And this is why the crown of thorns are a problem. Okay, so let's explain exactly what a COTS outbreak is. So this picture was taken actually in the Indian Ocean. I was there. We were there doing research this past October. And here you can see that there are lots of starfish in this picture. And there's probably even more starfish in this picture that we can't see. Because remember, they like to crawl and hide. So an outbreak is actually described as 30 animals in a hectare. In a hectare, we're talking like 2.5 acres. That's the actual definition of a primary outbreak. There can then be secondary and third outbreaks, which, like we talked about, once the corals go through and eat all their favorite foods, then their second favorite foods, and then their third favorite foods. Those are the 3 phases of an outbreak. So how does an outbreak happen? So there are many schools of thought on this, and they're all just hypotheses. Nothing has actually been proven yet. But one school of thought that's pretty widely accepted is that nutrient runoff causes more nutrient input into the water column, which gives actually more food for the baby or the juvenile larva COTS to eat, and then more of those larvae are then able to survive and then come up from the depths and eat the reef. The second is the lack of predators that are there anymore. So the Napoleon wrasse, the triggerfish, and the trumpet tritons are all being harvested, and so there's nothing left to keep these organisms in check from a population outbreak. And so the loss of corals is also a problem because they can take a very, very long time to recover, if they can recover at all. Okay, so here's a before and after picture of what actually the reef looks like before an outbreak, which is this picture here, and what happens after an outbreak, which is here. So here on this picture on the right here, we have some butterfly fish here. We have a high biodiversity of different types of corals. The water is very clear. And on the left, and this is a reef in French Polynesia actually. On the left is another reef in French Polynesia that had a crown of thorns outbreak back in 2005, 2006. And so this is now what the reef looks like after the crown of thorns have gone through and literally eaten every piece of coral they could see. And as you can, there's not much life on this reef anymore, and the water is turbid, it has a high level of nutrient input, and there's no fish. Okay, mitigating a COTS outbreak. So when there is an actual crown of thorns outbreak, what do we do? So as scientists, we go in. So again, if there's 1 or 2 crown of thorns on the reef, that's completely fine. That's absolutely sustainable for the reef. But if there's an outbreak, we will intervene. And it's actually a pretty low-tech, low-cost approach that we have. So if you can see this white PVC pipe, which probably a lot of you are familiar with what PVC pipe is, we use that to carefully pry the crown of thorns into these mesh bags here, as many as we can fit in, and then we bring them out of the water here and bring them onto land. And once they're on land, we spread them all out, and we do some other research that I'll talk a little bit about later. But we dig a hole on the beach, and we literally just bury them in it. And this is the preferred method of removal and disposal because the crown of thorns can actually act as a fertilizer. Again, they're a very highly organic organism that can be used as fertilizer. And now I'm going to just show you a video of what it looks like underwater when we're collecting Crown of Thorns. Alright, so this is me and another scientist, and we're on a reef in Fiji during an actual outbreak. And so we go in and dive gear and scuba gear, and we very carefully try to pry the Crown of Thorns out from underneath the corals and put them safely and carefully into mesh bags, like here. And again, this is a very tiresome process. The Crown of Thorns are actually much stronger than you would think because of those suction cup tube feet. And so it takes a lot of effort to try to pry them out. And also we don't want to get spined. So once we come up out of the water, we dump them out, and we do various types of research on them and count them. And I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Okay, so our COTS research. So one of the things we do, other than just removal, is we actually want to study these organisms. So once we bring them back up on the ship or back up onto land, we do measurements and counts. So we count every collection that we we've completed. We count every starfish, and then we also measure every starfish. And we measure every starfish from the longest end of one leg to the longest end of the other leg. So the diameter of the starfish. And here are these are two locations that we went to last year recently, where we only focused on our COTS research. Here on the right here, this is an atoll called Aitutaki, which I know is a long word, but it's an island that's in the Cook Islands near French Polynesia. And we had witnessed an outbreak in 2013. And we went back in this past summer in 2015 to see if the reef has made any progress, or if there's still any COTS there, and if the corals are actually recovering. When we were there, we collected 276 Crown of Thorns. Now here on the left, these group of islands are called the Maldives, and they're located in the Indian Ocean, which is right here, just south of India, and here they're actually having a primary outbreak, and we collected 7,396 starfish in only 2 weeks. And there were still plenty more starfish there to collect when we left. So they're actually having a major outbreak right now, which we've been back in touch with the people that are out doing research there locally, and they're still trying to mitigate this process. So the other facet of our COTS research is genetics. And so right now it is widely understood that there's only one species of Crown of Thorns, and I'm trying to see if that's actually true. And so what I do, this is me here, and I take tweezers and I take the tube feet from maybe 5, 6, or 7 tube feet from a Crown of Thorns and put them into these little vials to do genetic work on it. And here's the little tube feet right here. So if there are more than one different type of species, this can tell us more about the Crown of Thorns behavior and how they act differently in different parts of the world. So here I have, this is a box of samples. As you can see, we've got these tiny little vials that are full of these little suckerfish or sucker tube feet. And we've collected probably about 500 samples from all over the world that we're going to do some genetic tests on to see if there is any difference. Okay, so can coral reefs recover? So it's not all doom and gloom. They can recover. However, there's definitely certain things and certain environmental conditions that need to be kind of the perfect condition for the reef to recover at a reasonable rate. So here I have circled in red are these smaller corals. These are juvenile corals that have actually just reseeded back on what was an area that was affected by a crown of thorns. And so once once the corals are actually able to come back, and here as well, you can see some of these smaller coral colonies. That's how you can tell when a reef is recovering. However, sometimes, though, there are other stressors that the corals are trying to fight as well. So severe storms, coral diseases, other corallivores that eat corals. So they kind of are fighting an uphill battle, but they can recover. Okay, so how do crown of thorns affect biodiversity? So if you can imagine, so the first thing we need to talk about is in reef ecology, there is a term known as coral reef resilience. And what this means is how well corals resist change and recover from it. So some corals are better dealing with stressors like water temperature changes and storm events. We would call these resilient corals. But not all corals are healthy and strong enough to deal with these changes. But when a crown of thorns outbreaks happens, no coral can survive that because the crown of thorns doesn't pick and choose which coral. And when this happens, all of the corals are eaten, even the more resilient corals, and it will lower the biodiversity of the reef. So if you think of the analogy of a forest fire, and you can imagine, imagine how devastating a forest fire is. So when the fire goes through and destroys all the trees and plants and destroys some of the animals and the resources that those animals needed from the forest that's now destroyed by the fire, it takes a very, very long time for that forest to recover, if it actually recovers at all. So that analogy can be tied with a crown of thorns outbreak. If you wipe out all the corals, there will be none left to reseed that reef. And then you lose not only corals, but many of the creatures that depend on that reef to live. So what can you do? You're probably thinking, we're sitting here in the United States, how can we help places that I've mentioned today that you've probably never even heard of? It's a good question. So here, the picture here on the left is a trumpet triton, and the picture here on the right is some coral jewelry. And so what you can do is practice healthy and responsible reef habits, meaning don't go to, don't buy shells at tourist shops, because the people that work at those tourist shops go and bring in those shells from off the reef, and we need trumpet tritons to help combat the crown of thorns problem. And then also any coral byproducts or any coral jewelry, we really need to leave the corals in the ocean and not harvest them for, even though they're so beautiful, we cannot harvest them for jewelry or anything else. The other thing you can do is, of course, educate. So after this talk with your friends about this, tell your parents, your grandparents about it, and just get the word out that there is the reefs are in danger, and there are things that we can do to help. So we have lots of other
awesome
resources that you can
Alex,
check out.
So we
on
do
our
have a
website.
lot of questions coming in, so I was gonna get you some of those
Coral Reef
first.
Education portal,
And you were just talking about
created by our Director of Education, Amy Heemsoth. And then we're also on social networks. So we've got Twitter and a Facebook account, a Google Plus account. And then please check out our website. You can have a host of different resources about crown of thorns, corals, fish, and our research that we do here at the Foundation.
Awesome. Alex, so we do have a lot of questions coming in, so I was going to get you some of those. First, and you were just talking about guidance, and there was a question about predators for crown of thorns corals. So is there only one? What's that situation like?
Is there only one? What's that situation? Okay, so no, there are more than one. So the helmet snail and the trumpet triton are two gastropods or snails that eat the crown of thorns, but also triggerfish and Napoleon wrasse. Those are two fish that eat the crown of thorns. They have very strong, almost mallet-like mouths that are able to crunch through those thorns, and they're also able to digest the toxin.
Great. And then another question was about their life expectancy of a crown of thorns coral. What's the average life expectancy? Is that something that we know? the average life expectancy? Is that something that we know?
So it isn't something that we know for certain. Again, the life history of this organism is still relatively unknown. However, for a crown of thorns to reach 40 centimeters is probably 2 to 3 years old. And a crown of thorns, again, that is 50 centimeters is going to be an older starfish. But again, no, there's no exact life expectancy.
And then we had two questions sort of about starfish anatomy. One, how can you tell the difference between a male and a female? And the second question was, do they have eyes?
Okay, so no, you cannot tell the difference by just looking at the starfish, which is male and female. However, if you're there when they're spawning, you can tell because the female spawns eggs that are kind of an orange-yellowy cloud color, and males are white. That they release sperm, which is white, into this like white cloud. But to actually sex the organism, you have to take out the starfish out of the water and dissect it to see if it has gonads or not, to tell what the actual sex of the organism is. Starfish have eyes. That's a very interesting question. No, they do not have eyes. They have how they are able to tell where a coral is or where they're going. They have pheromones. So they have a heightened sense of, sense of smell, you can call it. And they're able to actually smell the coral tissue and smell other COTS. So they know, and they're predators as well. So they have a very heightened sense for certain pheromones.
And then we have a question coming in about climate change and how has climate change affected crown of thorns corals. We talk about effects on coral reefs a lot. We don't necessarily talk about starfish.
Starfish. Sure. Okay. So with climate change right now, one thing that's being attributed to climate change is the warming of oceans. And of course, when the ocean stays at a higher temperature for a longer period of time, the crown of thorns, it's being suggested that the crown of thorns spawn more frequently, and also the warmer the water, the higher nutrients are able to grow. And so the more nutrients in the water, again, feeds back to more food for those COTS larvae, for more COTS to survive once they've settled on a reef.
And let's see here. Our last question that we got in is about your job and your degree. So what exactly is your degree in, and what was the career path that brought you to what you're doing now?
Okay. So it's a pretty classic story of I've always wanted to be a marine biologist since I was a little girl. I'm a Florida girl growing up on going to the beaches on the West Coast. And so when I went to undergrad, I went to Holy Cross, which is a liberal arts school up in Massachusetts, and I got a Bachelor's of Science degree in environmental biology, and then I also got a Bachelor's of Arts degree in environmental philosophy. I then went and got 2 master's degrees from Nova Southeastern University, which has a very good coral program. That's down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and those degrees are in marine environmental biology and coastal zone management. And while I was there working on my degree, I was asked actually to come out and help volunteer on one of the first Global Reef Expedition to the Bahamas. And ever since then, I've worked with the foundation, going in the field and being helping them with this Global Reef Expedition.
Awesome, thank you. And how would, another question that came in that asked about the effect on coral reefs if all crown of thorns starfish were gone, and what effects would that have on ecosystems as a whole? Is this a species that we want to wipe out or protect?
No, right. That's a very good question, actually. So no, the eradication of any species is not good. Crown of thorns are there for a reason. They actually are in small numbers are what's known as a localized disturbance. And so when you have these smaller localized disturbances, it actually helps promote biodiversity because it can help weed out some of those resilient type corals, or help promote the resilient type corals to proliferate. So no, we don't want them all gone, but they are they're definitely in overwhelming numbers right now. It's a problem that a lot of the coral reef community is really just starting to understand, and we have a long way to go.
Definitely. So we don't have like a perfect number or a perfect ratio of Crown of Thorns starfish to coral reefs at this point.
Right. 1 or 2 Crown of Thorns on a reef is that's great. That actually is healthy. But when we're having 2, 3, 400 in a very small area, it's just too many, and the corals can't keep up.
Great. And one last question we had come in was, have you ever been thorned, and what happens if you are thorned? What's that like?
Oh, it is painful, let me tell you. So yes, I've been spined probably too many times. Once is too many, but I've been spined quite a bit. And everyone's physical reaction is different to it. But my reaction, of course, you bleed a lot, and your hand swells up or your leg swells up. But the tissue around where the spine goes in starts to like slough off, and you get these like calluses that just peel off, and the spines never come out. I still have probably 6 or 7 spines in my hands right now that just get embedded, and you're not able to get them out.
That does not sound like a fun experience. So definitely want to practice caution. Not something that people should be going out and trying to peel off coral reefs themselves by any means.
Absolutely
Awesome.
not, no.
Someone asked, do the spines that are still in your hand hurt?
No, they don't hurt. I actually don't have feeling. The nerve damage has been quite substantial where those spines actually went in, and so I don't have a whole lot of feeling in some of my fingers, but no. It's
awesome.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for joining us today. This has been a really informative webinar, and we are so excited to have you with us. I just switched the slide back so that everyone can see how to connect with Living Oceans Foundation through their website. They have a really, really great educational portal that I would definitely recommend checking out. And you can also check out, Earth Echo's educational portal at earthecho.org. We will be following up next week to all registrants of this webinar. We'll be making sure that all of the educational resources are sent to you, and that you're able to also access resources on how you can help, ways that you can help promote biodiversity and protect species in your own backyard. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Great, thanks for having me.